Dragon King Zevran Holt ordered the Blue Ember Garden burned, while its keeper stood inside it. Odelia Fenn did not run when the first torch struck the winter lavender. Blue fire moved along beds of frostmint, coalroot, and pale ember lilies she had spent 23 years teaching to survive beneath northern ash. Royal soldiers formed a black line around the garden walls so no servant, patient, or village healer could interfere. The court watched from the stone terrace as though destroying a woman's work were an act of protection. Odelia stood beneath the central ash tree in a dark wool apothecary gown, her silver-brown hair braided over one shoulder. Age had softened neither her face nor the steadiness of her gray-green eyes. No flame burned in her palms. That absence had become the court's favorite evidence. Court apothecary Lisenvaro descended the terrace steps carrying a glass vial wrapped in silver wire. "The king's blood contains blue ember poison," she announced, "the same residue found in Widow Fenn's medicinal beds." Odelia looked at the vial. "You heated the sample. Dragon blood must be warmed before examination. Not above pearl temperature." Above pearl heat. Nightbane learns to wear the color of ember lily. Blue ember poison had not been found in Zevran's blood. It had been manufactured from Nightbane by heat. The silver wire around the vial had fogged near the base. Someone had heated it far beyond a careful test. Several court physicians glanced toward one another. Lucena did not. "Your methods belong to another generation. Poison has not changed because my hair has. What changed," Lizen said, "is your capacity to recognize it." They had mistaken the fading of visible flame for the end of judgment. The insult was delivered gently. That was how the court preferred its cruelty toward older women wrapped in concern, spoken as though removal were kindness. Odelia turned toward the upper terrace. Zevran sat beneath the black dragon standard, one hand gripping the arm of his chair. His armor concealed most of the tremors, but not all. A faint blue shadow pulsed beneath the skin at his throat. His dragon fire was failing inside him. Odelia had seen it 3 weeks earlier. His flame had emerged too cold, edged in violet rather than gold. When she warned that something had entered his dragon heart, Lisan called it an attempt to regain relevance. "You treated me with ember lily tincture," Zevran said. 7 years ago. The poison carries the same trace. The trace was created after the blood was overheated. Lisan raised the vial. "She has no active flame with which to test that claim." Odelia flexed her fingers. Blue fire had once warmed roots, opened seed casings, and drawn venom from dragon-burned flesh. Then it faded from one finger, then another. The court called it decline. No one asked where the fire had gone. They only saw that it no longer performed where they expected to see it. Zevran stood, though the movement cost him. "Your garden is the only confirmed source of the residue. It is the only source you permitted Lysen to test." A hard silence crossed the terrace. "Let me examine your fire directly." "She has been stripped of healing authority," Lysen said, "by your petition, by the king's seal." Zevran's jaw tightened. 6 days earlier, he had forbidden Odelia from treating royal blood or distributing flame-grown medicine without Lysen's approval. The decree made every person she healed into evidence of disobedience. He descended until only the low garden gate separated them. Years ago, Odelia had treated his campaign burns for 9 nights after palace physicians proposed cutting away the damaged scales. He remembered the warmth of her hands, but memory did not make him stop the soldiers. "If the poison began here," he said, "the garden cannot remain. And if it did not, then its destruction prevents no further harm." That is not an answer. It is the decision. Odelia looked beyond him at Lysen. Her white sleeves were fastened with blue crystal clasps. Ash bees sensed the mineral salts used to preserve concentrated venom. A smear of blue residue marked the inside of one clasp hinge, where no apothecary's ornament should carry medicine. 3 bees had circled Lysen during the winter audience. She had crushed one beneath her glove. Now the hives remained silent beneath the burning ash tree. Zevran lifted one hand. "Complete the burn." Zevran had ordered the cure burned before asking why poison bloomed only after Lysen heated his blood. A soldier threw another torch. Flame climbed the medicinal trellis. Odelia moved toward the frost-lung beds grown for the poor quarter. "Stop here," Lysen ordered. 2 soldiers caught Odelia by the arms. "Those plants treat children who cannot survive palace fees. The crown will replace necessary medicines," Zevran said. "With which stores?" He did not answer. You have never counted the people your infirmary turns away. Pain crossed his face, not remorse, but something physical. Blue light flashed beneath his armor. Zevran dropped to one knee. Lysen hurried forward with the vial. His Majesty requires distance from the garden. No, he requires you to stop heating the poison into his blood. Zevran traiturize. A thin blue flame poured from his mouth and struck the stones without heat. It curled around Lysen's sleeve and darkened where it touched the crystal clasp. Poison, answering poison. Then the first hive opened. One ash bee entered the burning air, its wings black glass around a silver ember. A second followed. Then hundreds, then thousands. They flew through the blue flames without burning. The ash bees did not judge poison. They gathered what the garden still held. Smoke from coal root, oil from ember lily, frostmint pollen, and the blue residue clinging to Lysen's crystal clasp. Antidote was not mercy. It was chemistry with wings. The bees moved from plant to smoke, from smoke to crystal, carrying fragments too small for a human hand to separate. They had not obeyed Odelia. They had followed the ingredients Lysen's test tried to hide. Only when the balance was complete did they lower the dose toward the one hand in the garden not stained by royal poison, crystal salt, or forced flame. A clear, golden drop gathered at the center of the swarm and fell into Odelia's open palm. Zevran collapsed fully onto the stones before her. Lysen reached for Odelia's wrist. "Give it to him." Odelia closed her fingers around the dose, not to deny him, to keep the last living measure from being burned with the rest. She looked beyond the king. Royal fire still devoured the frost-lung beds and the medicines prepared for people who would never enter the palace infirmary. "Stop burning the medicine," she said. "Your king is not the only patient your fire is killing." The antidote in Odelia's palm was not enough to save the king and the garden both. Zevran lay on one knee among the burning stones, one hand pressed beneath his breastplate, while cold blue flame leaked between his teeth. Lysen reached for Odelia again. "She is withholding treatment from the crown." Odelia stepped beyond her grasp. "The dose cannot be repeated if you burn every ingredient that made it. The garden produced the poison. The garden produced an answer after your test changed nightbane into false blue residue." Zevran's head lifted. Pain had stripped command from his face, but not comprehension. Behind Odelia, fire reached the lower frost-lung beds. Leaves curled inward. Their silver veins blackened one after another. She opened her hand just enough for the golden drop to remain visible. Coal root smoke slowed the venom. Ember lily oil carried the counteragent. Frostmint pollen kept it from burning through his dragon heart. Lysen looked toward the soldiers. "She is using folk chemistry to delay royal treatment. I am telling you what must remain alive if his blood requires another dose. The royal infirmary can reproduce it." "With what coal root?" Lysen did not answer. Odelia turned toward Zevran. "If the fire continues, this will be the last complete antidote your court can make." His fingers tightened against the stone. Then he forced one word through the failing flame. "Stop." The soldiers hesitated. Zevran raised his head. "Stop the burn." Buckets overturned into the beds. Royal fire was smothered beneath wet soil, ash, and torn wool cloaks. The blue flames resisted longest around the frost-lung herbs, then sank into smoke. Only when the final torch was lowered did Odelia kneel before the king. Not close enough for tenderness, close enough to work. She placed the golden drop beneath his tongue and pressed 2 fingers against the pulse at his throat. His dragonfire convulsed. A bronze flare struck the stones, then collapsed into blue. Zevran's hand caught her wrist. The grip was instinctive, hard enough to hurt. Odelia did not pull away until his breathing steadied. Then she removed his hand herself. "The poison has slowed," she said. "It has not left." Lysen crouched beside him with another vial. "He requires my stabilizing draft." Odelia smelled the open glass. Sweet iron, burned saffron, and beneath both, the bitter edge of nightbane. "Close it." Lysen's eyes sharpened. "You no longer hold royal authority. You are carrying more of the poison toward him. It is a dragonfire tonic." "Then drink it." The court physicians looked away. Lysen recorked the vial. Around them the ash bees descended from the smoke. They did not form a crown, a symbol, or a name. They followed residue. Several settled on the scorched ember lilies. Others moved across the wet coal root bark, A dark cluster gathered near Lysen's right wrist, where blue crystal salt remained inside the clasp hinge. Lysen struck at them with her sleeve. Odelia caught the movement. Do not crush them. They are contaminated. They are tracing contamination. The bees moved from the clasp to the silver wire around the heated blood vial, then back again. Not loyalty. Not accusation. A material path. Odelia pointed to the clasp. Remove it. Lysen stood. My personal ornaments are not evidence. No apothecary wears venom. Preserving crystal beside an open blood test. Blue crystal is used throughout the royal infirmary. To stabilize concentrated compounds, Odelia said. Not to fasten sleeves. Zevran's breathing remained uneven, but his voice had returned. Give her the clasp. Lysen looked down at him. Majesty, your judgment is impaired. So you have told the court for 3 weeks whenever I questioned the treatment. The sentence was not an apology to Odelia. It was the first crack in the authority Lysen had built around his illness. Slowly, she removed the clasp. Odelia did not touch it with bare skin. She wrapped it in an unburned frostlung leaf and placed it beside the heated vial. Blue residue darkened the leaf's veins. Lysen answered immediately. Garden smoke transferred onto the crystal during the fire. The residue sits inside the hinge, Odelia said. Smoke settles on surfaces. It does not crawl beneath sealed metal. Zevran pushed himself upright against the garden wall. Open the blood, heating protocol. Lysen's face became still. The emergency records are held in the royal infirmary. Then send for them. Moving you now is dangerous. I did not order myself moved. A palace physician hurried toward the infirmary archive. Odelia remained beside Zevran only long enough to count his pulse again. He watched her hands. They no longer carried visible flame, yet every movement had more precision than the court's entire diagnosis. You knew the dose would not cure me, he said. I knew one dose could not undo weeks of poisoning. You believe it was given over weeks? Your fire has been cooling in stages. His gaze shifted toward Lysen. She said nothing. The protocol ledger arrived beneath 2 royal seals. Lysen attempted to take it first, but Zevran placed his hand over the cover. Who ordered the final blood sample heated? The attending physician read the entry. Court Apothecary Lysen Varro. To what temperature? The physician hesitated. Lysen answered for him. Emergency Dragon. Blood examination permits elevated heat when royal flame is unstable. Odelia opened the ledger to the temperature column. Pearl heat was marked by a white circle. The recorded sample had been heated 3 levels above it. High enough to change nightbane, she said. High enough to reveal concealed ember residue, Lysen replied. No, high enough to manufacture it. The protocol listed the original blood color before heating. Black violet, nightbane. Not blue ember poison. Not ember lily. Not anything grown in the Blue Ember Garden. Zevran turned the final page. The infirmary inventory recorded every nightbane reserve held by the crown. 1 vial had been withdrawn repeatedly during the weeks his dragonfire began failing. The authorization seal belonged to Lysen Varro. The garden had not poisoned the Dragon King. But beside the withdrawal line, a margin note carried a purpose Odelia had not expected. For royal dragon heart stabilization. Repeat until flame obedience returns. The nightbane had not been recorded as a poison meant to kill Zevran's fire. It had been recorded as treatment meant to teach his fire obedience. The bees had finished tracing poison. Now the ledgers had to explain why the royal infirmary called it treatment. Zevran remained against the garden wall while physicians carried wet blankets over the surviving beds. The antidote had steadied his pulse, but blue fire still moved beneath his throat in irregular waves. He was not cured. He was merely no longer dying quickly. Lysen stood beside the open protocol ledger. Nightbane in measured quantity is a recognized dragonheart stabilizer, she said. It suppresses violent flame surges before they tear through the ribs. Odelia examined the withdrawal dates. 1 dose after Zevran's first tremor. Another 3 days later. Then every second night for nearly a month. A stabilizer is reduced when the patient steadies. His fire did not steady, because you continued cooling it. Lysen's expression remained professionally patient. Uncontrolled dragonfire does not respond to rural garden principles. His Majesty's flame was already resisting his body before treatment began. Zevran looked toward her. You told me the numbness proved the medicine was working. It proved the dangerous surges were contained. You told me my inability to summon full fire was exhaustion. It was safer than allowing another internal rupture. Odelia turned the page. Each dose carried a response mark. Reduced spontaneous ignition. Reduced independent flame release. Improved treatment compliance. Then, in Lucen's own hand, continue until fire compliance is established. Odelia tapped the line. You were not treating pain. I was preventing the king's dragonheart from killing him. You were teaching his fire to wait for your draft. Lucen's gaze cooled. Every powerful flame must learn control. Control by whom? The question remained between them. Zevran took the ledger from Odelia and read the response marks himself. His hand trembled against the page. For weeks, he had believed his weakening fire proved an illness, worsening, despite Lucen's care. The record showed something else. His fire weakened after each treatment. When the dose faded, his natural flame surged back violently. Lucen then classified the surge as instability and increased the next dose. His fire had not failed in battle. It had been trained to fail in the infirmary. Why did I never see these entries? He asked. You granted me emergency authority over royal treatment. I granted you permission to keep me alive. Those are not always separate powers. Odelia looked at him. Zevran had called her garden dangerous while signing his own dragon heart into someone else's custody. He heard the judgment in her silence even before she spoke. You gave her authority broad enough to rename every reaction as proof she needed more authority. His jaw tightened. He did not defend himself. He also did not apologize. Open every stabilization record tied to Nightbane. Lucen closed one hand over the ledger. Those files contain private infirmary histories. Open them. Majesty. Frail healers and unstable flame-bearers entrusted this court with their dignity. Odelia's attention sharpened. Healers? Lucen looked at her. Older practitioners sometimes develop dangerous flame wandering. Suppression protects patients and the healers themselves. Odelia remembered the language used against her. Senescence of magical function. Progressive loss of safe flame control. Recommended withdrawal from public treatment. She had accepted the assessment because her palms had already begun cooling. Lucene had presented the tonic as a diagnostic aid, meant to reveal whether any stable fire remained. Odelia crossed to the protocol chest. Bring my flame assessment. Lucene did not move. You no longer hold a royal license. My record does. Zevran looked at the attending physician. Find it. The assessment arrived beneath a faded blue seal. Odelia opened it with hands that had not burned for 4 years. The first page described her age. The second described heat changes in her skin. The third listed every occasion her flame had failed to appear during examination. No page listed the compound she had been given before each test. She found it hidden beneath an abbreviated reagent mark. N7 stabilization medium. The same code appeared beside Zevran's Nightbane doses. The same compound that cooled his flame was used to test the fading of my hands. Lucen answered calmly. Assessment requires suppression. We must distinguish voluntary flame from unstable residue. You gave me Nightbane and called the silence afterward decline. You were already losing control. I was losing visible fire. An older healer who cannot produce flame consistently becomes a danger when patients continue trusting her reputation. Odelia's voice lowered. They called my flame senescence because theft sounds kinder when written as diagnosis. Lucen's composure tightened. No one stole your flame. Then where did the suppressed heat go? Flame dissipates. Not blue medicinal fire. It binds to living carriers, treated glass, or ember salts. The attending physician glanced toward the infirmary doors. Odelia saw it. What is stored there? Lucen stepped between her and the terrace. Nothing relevant to the king's condition. Zevran rose despite the poison still shaking his legs. Open the infirmary. The royal medical wing stood beyond the garden wall. Its lower chamber smelled of salt, scorched linen, and preserved venom. Lucen led them past treatment tables toward a locked iron cabinet set into the stone. Blue crystal lined its hinges. The same crystal she wore at her wrist. 3 seals closed the doors. 1 belonged to the crown. 2 belonged to Lucen. This cabinet contains residual flame samples, she said, collected for safety after failed assessments. Failed healers, Odelia said. Retired healers. Women whose fire vanished after you gave them the same compound. Lucena did not answer. Zevran broke the crown seal. Cold blue light spilled through the opening. Inside stood rows of narrow ember vessels. Each held a small living flame. Some trembled weakly. some pressed against the glass as though still remembering hands. Labels hung beneath them. Names: Age, license withdrawn, unsafe decline confirmed. Not one label named the compound given before the flame failed. Odelia read them one by one. Women she had trained beside, women the court had quietly replaced. At the center of the cabinet stood an empty vessel marked with her name: Odelia Fenn. Flame extraction incomplete. The vessel marked Odelia Fenn was empty, and that frightened Lizen more than any stolen flame would have. She closed the cabinet door halfway, as though darkness could make the missing fire less visible. Extraction failure confirms instability, she said. Her flame could not be safely separated from deteriorating tissue. Odelia looked at the empty glass. These were not souls. The cold blue light from the other vessels moved across her face. They were what the infirmary called residual flame samples, the heat left behind after a healer had been declared unsafe to hold her own fire. Licen's posture remained exact. Residual containment prevents uncontrolled flame from entering public treatment. Blue medicinal fire does not dissipate. Not cleanly, no. It bends. To prepared glass, under proper supervision. To living roots, Odelia said. To healing oils. To insects raised inside medicinal smoke. Licen's eyes shifted toward the garden doors. Only once, Zevran noticed. He stood beside the cabinet with one hand braced against the stone. The antidote had slowed the poison, but his dragon heart still struck unevenly beneath his armor. His gaze moved from Licen's seals to the third mark broken across the cabinet frame. The crown. Your seal is on the cabinet, Majesty, Odelia said. Not Licen's alone. Zevran touched the fractured wax. What authority did it grant? Licen answered before any physician could. Emergency flame containment under the Royal Medical Safety Decree. I signed that decree after the South Tower fire because an unstable healer burned 6 patients while attempting treatment. And this cabinet was built under it? It was expanded under it. Odelia read the labels again. Most belonged to women beyond their first youth, healers whose hands had cooled, apothecaries whose fire had become intermittent, midwives whose flame appeared only when treating fever or birth wounds. The court had called inconsistency danger. Then it had taken what remained. Show us their consent records, Odelia said. Licen's expression hardened by a fraction. Medical withdrawal includes standard containment consent. Show us. Zevran looked toward the attending physician. Open the files. A narrow record drawer stood beneath the ember vessels. The physician unlocked it with trembling hands. Each file carried the same sequence. Assessment failed. License withdrawn. Residual flame secured. Consent assumed upon withdrawal. Odelia laid one page on the cabinet shelf. Consent assumed upon license withdrawal is not consent. The decree recognizes containment as a condition of public safety, Licen said. You first called their flame unsafe, then your own diagnosis became permission to take it. They could no longer control what they carried, according to tests performed after N7 suppression. Licen's voice remained calm. Older flame becomes unpredictable. The compound separates unstable heat from weakened tissue before it harms the patient. You gave them a substance that quieted their fire, measured the silence, and called the silence proof. You are romanticizing decline. No. Odelia looked at the vessels. I am reading the order of events. Zevran took the decree file from the physician. His signature filled the final page. The authority was broad. Any healer judged medically unsafe could lose license, access to patients, and ownership of residual flame without separate consent. He had not ordered anyone's fire taken. He had signed a law that made taking it legal after the infirmary supplied the diagnosis. Licen watched him read. You asked the medical court to prevent another disaster. I asked for containment of dangerous flame. And we contained it, after your office decided what dangerous meant. The poison had not softened him. It had only made each word cost more. He turned toward Odelia. What happened during your extraction? She remembered the table, blue crystal beneath her wrists. Licen calling each missing spark confirmation of decline. A cold pressure moving from her palms into the testing channels. Then the sudden shattering of the receiving vessel. They gave me N7, Odelia said. My hands cooled. The cabinet glass cracked before it collected anything. Because your flame had become fragmented, Licen replied. No, because it was already elsewhere. A faint vibration passed through the infirmary floor. Not from the vessels, from beyond the wall. In the damaged garden, the ash bees lifted from the wet beds in uneven groups. They did not form a symbol or gather around Odelia's name. They followed heat. A thin blue pulse moved from the empty vessel's crystal base through the cabinet hinges and into the stone foundation. Outside, ember lilies answered with pale light. Coalroot bark warmed beneath the ash. Frostmint leaves opened despite the fire damage. The bees moved from one living trace to another, carrying heat across the garden's surviving beds. Lysen stepped toward the cabinet controls. Odelia blocked her. You knew the vessel was empty. I knew extraction failed. You knew my fire had not dissipated. Uncollected flame is more dangerous than contained flame. You searched for it, for public safety, for ownership. Zevran's eyes moved toward the garden. What is happening out there? Odelia placed her palm against the infirmary wall. She felt no flame in her skin. But beneath the stone, warmth moved through roots she had tended for 23 years, through oils she had distilled, through pollen carried between seasons, through ashbee wings that had learned medicinal heat from flowers warmed by her hands. They had tried to take the flame from her hands, but Odelia had spent 23 years teaching it to live somewhere no cabinet could hold. My flame did not vanish, she said. It learned to survive without being seen. Lysen's composure finally broke enough to show fear. If your fire has dispersed through the garden, every medicinal bed is contaminated by uncontrolled personal flame. No, every bed was cultivated with it. That garden is no longer medicine. It is an extension of an unlicensed healer. Odelia looked toward the burned terraces. The garden did not merely hold medicine. It held the part of me the court failed to steal. Zevran closed the decree file. How much survived the burn? Odelia listened through her palm. Some root beds still carried warmth. Others had gone silent. The frost-lung section was faint. The northern coalroot bed barely answered. Each destroyed plant had taken part of the hidden flame with it. Not because the garden obeyed her, because she had spent decades transferring heat into living medicine until her body no longer held it alone. She opened her eyes. As much as the garden survived, a physician looked toward Zevran's unstable blue pulse. And the antidote? Odelia removed her hand from the wall. It depends on the same living chain. Outside, one blackened ember lily collapsed into ash. A blue pulse vanished beneath Odelia's palm. The burning had not merely destroyed plants. It had killed part of the flame Lysen failed to extract. And if the Blue Ember Garden died, the last remaining antidote line would die with it. By dawn, Odelia had divided the Blue Ember Garden into what could still answer and what had already gone cold. White cord marked the living beds. Black cord marked the dead. The frost-lung terrace carried only 3 surviving rows. Half the coalroot had burned beneath the soil. The ember lilies nearest the infirmary wall opened and closed without light, as though something beyond the stone were pulling warmth from their stems. Zevran stood at the garden gate while royal physicians waited behind him. His breathing had steadied, but the poison remained visible beneath his throat. Every few moments, blue fire pressed against his skin and disappeared again. Lysen watched from the terrace beneath guard, though no chains had been placed on her. The garden must be quarantined, she said. Its beds now contain dispersed personal flame from an unlicensed healer. Odelia knelt beside a coalroot plant and cut away its burned bark. The garden contains the same medicinal fire it held yesterday. Yesterday, we believed that fire belonged to the plants. It belongs to no one. You just called it yours. I said I taught it to live here. Teaching is not ownership. Lysen turned toward Zevran. If the widow's flame has entered every root and insect, no dose prepared here can be considered stable. The first dose kept me alive, Zevran said. Temporarily. We do not know what else it changed. Odelia looked at him. She needs you afraid of every improvement she did not authorize. Zevran did not defend Lysen. He also did not dismiss her. What does the garden require? Odelia rose. Water without palace, salts, fresh ash from untreated wood. Every surviving root uncovered before the heat trap below them turned sour. For the antidote? For the patients whose medicine you burned. His eyes moved toward the poor quarter healers waiting beyond the soldiers. They had arrived carrying clay bowls, linen wraps, and empty medicine baskets. None had been permitted through the gate. Zevran looked toward the captain. Let them enter. Lysen stepped forward. Majesty, unlicensed hands will contaminate the recovery. Odelia answered before he could. They are the hands that use these medicines after your infirmary refused the patients. The captain opened the gate. The healers entered without bowing to the court. They followed Odelia's instructions because they had worked beside her before the crown-decided age had made her dangerous. One loosened burned soil around the ember lilies. Another carried clean snowmelt to the frostlung beds. An elderly midwife pressed her fingers into the coal-root earth and frowned. The warmth is moving east. Odelia felt it too. Not upward into stems. Sideways. Toward the infirmary wall. She crossed the garden and placed both palms against the black stone foundation. A cold vibration answered beneath the surface. Blue crystal. Lysen's cabinet hinges were not the only crystal built into the medical wing. Bring a digging blade, Odelia said. Lysen's voice sharpened. The foundation channels are crown property. Zevran looked at her. What channels? Medical heat conduits. They stabilize infirmary temperatures. With residual flame, they recycle harmless excess. Odelia drove the blade beneath a flat garden stone. The soil came away in dark layers. Below it ran a narrow blue crystal vein wrapped in silver wire. The conduit passed beneath the ember lilies and entered the infirmary foundation. A faint pulse moved through it. With every pulse, one surviving flower dimmed. These beds are being drained, Odelia said. Lysen remained still. The conduits collect unstable overflow. There is no overflow. The roots are barely alive. The system cannot distinguish weakness from excess. Then it was designed not to. Zevran crouched beside the exposed crystal. His hand hovered above it. The same blue pulse moved under his throat. What does it feed? Odelia followed the conduit with her eyes. The ember cabinet. Lysen answered carefully. The cabinet requires heat to preserve residual samples. You use taken flame to preserve taken flame, Odelia said. The samples would decay without circulation, and when they weaken, the conduits draw replacement heat from approved medical sources. The Blue Ember Garden was never approved. Licenschazemitherse. It stood on royal infirmary ground. There it was. The court had not needed to own Odelia's flame directly. It had only needed to define everything her work touched as crown property. Zevran closed his hand around the crystal vein. Blue fire cut across his palm. His weakened dragon heart reacted instantly. He dropped to one knee, breath torn from him. Odelia caught his wrist before the conduit could draw more. Let go. He obeyed. She wrapped his burned palm in a wet, frost-slung leaf. You cannot break it with dragon fire. It will recognize royal flame as supply. How do we stop it? Cut the silver wire. Leave the crystal whole until the roots release. Lysen moved toward them. If you interrupt the cabinet circulation, every contained sample may become unstable. These were not souls, Odelia said, but they are still living heat. We do not shatter the cabinet. We separate it from what it has no right to consume. She handed Zevran the small garden shears. His hands were still numb from nightbane. The first cut missed. The second bent the wire. Odelia did not take the tool from him. Again, he adjusted his grip. The silver strand snapped. Across the garden, the ember lilies lifted. A pale blue glow returned to their veins. The ash bees rose from the lower beds, not toward Odelia or Zevran, but along the restored heat path between flower and root. Material following material. The garden exhaled warmth. Inside the infirmary, glass began ringing. Lysen turned toward the medical wing. One ember vessel had gone dark, not empty, unfed. A physician ran from the cabinet chamber. The stored samples are cooling. They are no longer being sustained by stolen garden heat, Odelia said. Zevran stood slowly. How many conduits? The physician looked at Lysen before answering. 7. Odelia followed the buried lines spreading beneath the garden. One ran toward the frostlung terrace. One toward coal rote. 5 disappeared beneath the poor quarter medicine beds. The fire had not been fading only because soldiers burned the plants. The royal infirmary had been feeding upon the garden for years. And Zevran's antidote depended on roots. Lysen's system was still draining. Odelia would not let Zevran cut the remaining conduits until every ember vessel had somewhere safe to cool. These are not souls, she told the physicians gathering in the infirmary chamber, but living flame can still collapse if you tear away its heat too quickly. Lysen stood beneath guard near the cabinet. You admit the circulation is necessary. I admit your system made stolen dependence look like preservation. The narrow vessels rang softly behind the iron doors. Without the first conduit, their blue flames had begun shrinking toward the glass bases. Odelia examined the shelves. Each sample required different handling. Birthing flame needed salt ash. Fever flame required dry frost mint fibers. Surgical fire had to be separated from iron, or it would continue cutting whatever held it. The labels recorded age and license status. They did not record the healer's specialty. Odelia recognized several by name. Bring the original assessment files. Lucena shook her head. The cabinet is already unstable. Sorting private histories now wastes time. The samples were taken from women whose knowledge your labels erased. Their knowledge is the only safe way to move them. Zevran stood beside the broken conduit map, pale beneath his armor. Open the files. The physicians obeyed. Odelia assigned each vessel to a temporary cradle prepared from materials that matched the healer's former work. Poor quarter healers carried ash bowls into the chamber. An elderly midwife lined one with clean birch salt. A former burn surgeon wrapped another in cold kohlroot bark. No one smashed the glass. No stolen fire flew dramatically back into waiting hands. They moved each sample by measure. Slowly, with witnesses. Lizen watched the work with controlled contempt. You are placing medically contained flame into unlicensed care. I am placing it with people who know what it was used for before you reduced it to residue. The crown cannot release dangerous heat based on sentimental recognition. Odelia lifted that to the file of a healer named Sarah Venn. Her flame closed internal bleeding for 37 years. Your assessment calls it erratic, because it appeared only when blood loss was present. That is conditional instability. That is specialization. The midwife beside her looked toward Lizen. You called wisdom failure because it stopped performing on command. Zevran heard the sentence. His gaze moved toward Odelia's hands. The court had demanded visible fire during scheduled tests, then used its absence to declare her empty. It had never asked whether her flame appeared only when medicine needed it. Odelia finished transferring the fourth sample. Cut the second conduit. Zevran took the garden shears again. His grip remained weak, but he did not ask another man to do it. The silver wire snapped. In the garden, the frost-lung terrace brightened faintly. Inside the cabinet, 3 vessels dimmed. Odelia steadied them one by one until their heat settled inside prepared ash cradles. The process continued. Third conduit. Fourth. Fifth. With each cut, another section of the Blue Ember Garden stopped feeding the infirmary walls. Kohlroot warmth returned beneath the soil. Ember lilies lifted blackened petals toward the morning light. Frostmint released a clean, sharp scent through the burned air. The ash bees followed those restored heat paths from root to pollen. They did not gather around Odelia or defend the garden from the court. They moved wherever the medicinal chain became complete again. At the 6th conduit, the attending physician hesitated. This line does not enter the cabinet. Odelia followed the blue crystal vein beneath the floor. Where does it go? The physician looked toward Zevran. The royal treatment chamber. Lizen stepped forward. That conduit maintains dragon heart temperature during emergency care. With whose flame? Odelia asked. General infirmary circulation. There is no general heat. Every vessel has a name. Zevran ordered the private chamber opened. It lay behind the central infirmary, windowless and lined with black stone. A bronze treatment basin stood at its center, surrounded by channels for blood warming, antidote preparation, and dragonfire suppression. Blue crystal ran beneath the basin. Odelia placed her palm above it. The heat pattern was familiar, not because it belonged to her body, because it carried the rhythm of medicines she had taught the garden to make. Kohlroot first, then ember lily, then the slower pulse of frostlung, the same sequence the ash bees had used to assemble Zevran's antidote. This chamber has been drawing from the Blue Ember Garden. Lizen answered smoothly. Royal Infirmary ground includes all medical heat sources within its walls. You did not merely preserve residual flame, Odelia said. You used it to strengthen royal treatment. Efficient circulation prevents waste. Waste? Her voice remained quiet. That is what you called the part of older women your court still needed after removing them. Zevran looked at the bronze basin where he had received Lizen's drafts night after night. Open the treatment heating ledger. The record was built into the chamber wall. Each royal dose listed 3 components. Medicinal compound, suppression medium, external flame source. The first weeks named cabinet samples by number, later entries named no healer at all. They carried only one phrase. Blue Ember replacement draw. Odelia traced the dates. The replacement draw began 4 years earlier. The same month her flame assessment failed. The same month Lysen declared her hands medically empty. They could not collect my fire into the vessel, Odelia said, so they drew it from everything I had already taught to hold it. Lysen lifted her chin. The garden occupied crown land and supplied the royal infirmary. Its heat was legally available. Legally, Odelia repeated. Zevran read the authorization beneath the first replacement entry. His own crown seal appeared beside Lysen's medical chain. He had approved expanded access to all infirmary heat sources after being told Odelia's flame had naturally failed. For 4 years, the chamber had warmed royal medicine with the part of her the court insisted no longer existed. Lysen spoke before he could. The system saved lives. Which lives? Odelia asked. The crown's survival protects the kingdom. And the poor quarter? Their remedies were distributed according to available supply. Their garden was drained to heat his treatment. Zevran looked toward the conduit beneath his basin. His poison-weakened hands curled at his sides. He had ordered Odelia's garden burned as useless contamination. Yet every night, his infirmary had fed upon its hidden flame. The final treatment entry had been written that morning. Blue Ember replacement draw increased. Garden source unstable. Full extraction recommended before loss. Beneath it appeared a location order. Not the Ember Cabinet. Not the royal chamber. The surviving central ash tree. Lysen had not burned the garden merely to destroy evidence. She had prepared to cut out the last place Odelia's flame remained concentrated. Lysen had not ordered the central ash tree cut because it was dying. She had ordered it cut because it was the only source she could not make obey from inside the infirmary. Odelia crossed the burned garden with Zevran and the physicians behind her. The ancient tree stood beneath a ceiling of smoke, its outer branches blackened but its trunk still warm. Ash bees moved through the surviving beds, following thin heat lines beneath the soil. They did not gather around Odelia. They traced coal root warmth, ember lily oil, and medicinal flame toward the tree's buried roots. Odelia pressed her fingers into a split in the bark. Something metallic answered beneath it. "Bring the narrow blade." A poor quarter healer handed her a root knife. Odelia lifted a strip of burned bark and exposed a silver extraction needle driven deep into the trunk. Blue crystal surrounded its base. A narrow wire ran from it beneath the garden wall toward the royal treatment chamber. Zevran's face hardened. "How long has that been there?" Lysen answered from behind the guards. "Centralized flame collection was installed after Widow Fenn's failed assessment. Without my knowledge," Odelia said. "The garden occupied royal medical land. You diagnosed my hands as empty, and then placed a needle into everything they had taught to burn." Lysen remained calm. Dispersed medicinal flame becomes unstable when its original bearer declines. The tree provided a safe concentration point. Odelia examined the metal. Ash had gathered beneath the needlehead, but not above it. The device had been inserted before the garden was burned. She touched the blackened bark surrounding it. The fire drove the living heat inward. Lysen did not answer. Odelia looked toward Zevran. She did not burn the garden only to destroy evidence. Fire forced the remaining flame away from the outer beds and into the central roots, where this system could collect it. Zevran turned to the extraction order. His crown seal appeared beneath Lysen's medical authorization. "You placed this before I ordered the burn. The order authorized emergency recovery if the garden became contaminated. You prepared the recovery before contamination was established. I prepared for the loss of a medical resource. You prepared to own whatever survived." Lysen's expression tightened. "The king's condition requires concentrated flame. Dispersed garden heat cannot be measured safely." "It can be measured," Odelia said. "You simply cannot control where it heals." A blue pulse traveled through the needle. The ember lilies dimmed. Zevran's throat brightened at the same moment. Odelia saw the exchange. The tree weakened. His dragon heart steadied. His body had been conditioned to depend upon flame taken from the garden. She caught his wrist and counted the beat beneath his skin. "What is it?" he asked. "Your fire is no longer only fighting Nightbane." Lysen spoke from the path. His dragon heart requires stabilization. "No, it expects replacement heat because you taught it that every natural surge would be followed by suppression and borrowed flame." Zevran looked toward the silver wire entering the tree. "If we remove it too quickly, your heart may answer the absence with another violent surge." Lysen lifted her chin. which is why full extraction is the only responsible course. Odelia released Zevran's wrist. You made him dependent, then called dependence proof that only your system could save him. I kept him alive. You kept his body waiting for medicine your office controlled. Zevran stood beneath the tree he had ordered burned. His breathing remained shallow, but his voice carried across the garden. No full extraction. Lucen faced him. Majesty, refusing the protocol may end your reign before sunset. Then show me another course, he said to Odelia. She looked toward the surviving beds. There is one. Lucen gave a quiet, dismissive breath. Garden tapering is untested. So was poisoning him until his fire obeyed your hand. Odelia marked the remaining living sections with white cord. The borrowed heat must be reduced gradually. The garden must recover enough to produce repeated antidote doses without losing its roots. Every conduit must be opened, but not all at once. And the king? A physician asked. He receives only what the garden can replace. Lucen's eyes sharpened. You would limit royal treatment according to damaged plants? I would stop pretending his life is the only life medicine serves. Odelia pointed toward the poor quarter healers. Every frost-lung remedy already promised leaves first. Every patient denied by the palace infirmary is entered before another royal dose is prepared. Zevran looked at the blackened beds his soldiers had nearly destroyed. Do it. Lucen stepped forward despite the guards. You are surrendering royal survival to an unlicensed widow. No, Odelia said. He is finally placing his treatment inside the same limits everyone else has endured. Zevran removed the crown clasp from his cloak and pressed it against the extraction needle. The silver mechanism unlocked. Odelia did not pull it free. Slowly, he followed her instruction. The needle emerged 1 finger's width. Blue fire surged beneath the bark. Zevran dropped to one knee as his dragon heart struck violently. Odelia steadied his shoulder. Not tenderly, but precisely. Breathe before the next pulse. He obeyed. The ash bees followed the released heat into nearby ember lilies. Their wings carried the warmth outward through the damaged beds. The tree's pulse steadied. Zevran removed the needle completely. Blue sap closed around the wound. 1 extraction line had been broken. 6 remained. Then the buried system answered. Every remaining needle ignited at once. Lucen's emergency protocol had recognized the loss of 1 collection point and accelerated the others. Blue fire rushed out of the surviving beds. Golroad bark went cold. Frostmint folded against the earth. Thousands of ash bees lifted along the collapsing material paths and moved toward the central tree. Not in loyalty, because every medicinal trace was being dragged to the same place. Odelia pressed both hands against the trunk. The entire hidden flame of the garden was being forced inward for final collection. The royal infirmary had begun extracting what the fire failed to destroy. The garden began dying in sections. First, the northern coalroot bed went cold. Then the frostmint folded inward, every leaf closing around its own fading pulse. Odelia kept both hands against the central ash tree, while the remaining extraction needles pulled hidden flame through the roots. Do not cut anything yet. Poor quarter healers had already taken blades to the exposed conduits. They stopped at once. Zevran remained on one knee beside the trunk, his dragon heart striking too fast beneath black armor. Lucen watched from the path. The emergency system is concentrating unstable flame before it disperses beyond recovery. It is emptying the medicine into your infirmary, Odelia said. It is preserving what remains. For whom? Lucen did not answer. Odelia followed the heat beneath the soil. The conduits did not all lead toward the ember cabinet. 5 entered the royal medical wing. 1 fed the treatment basin. The final line did not end inside the building. It returned beneath the garden and rose beneath Zevran. She looked at the blue pulse under his breastplate. Remove your armor. The physician stiffened. Lucen stepped forward. His Majesty cannot be exposed during dragon heart instability. Odelia looked directly at Zevran. Your body is part of the extraction system. He reached for the clasps himself. The breastplate opened. Beneath it, a dark blue treatment mark curved around his ribs and crossed the center of his chest. Silver threads had been burned into the skin in the shape of a restrained flame. Zevran stared down at it. When was this placed? Lucen's voice stayed controlled. During the first emergency stabilization, it allows excess heat to enter safely when the dragon heart cannot sustain itself. Whose excess heat? He asked. General infirmary circulation. Odelia touched the air above the mark without touching his skin. The pulse matched the central tree. It matched the weakened ember lilies. It matched the conduits draining the poor quarter beds. "There is no general flame," she said. "There is only heat taken from somewhere with a name. Lucen Folja hence. The king's survival protects every patient in the realm." No, that sentence protects every theft performed on his behalf. Another extraction pulse moved beneath them. The ash tree shuddered. Several bees dropped from the air when the ember lilies beneath them lost heat. Odelia turned toward the healers. "Prepare 7 living cradles. Coal root bark, frost lung fiber, untreated ash, and clean clay. 1 beside each conduit." The physicians hesitated. The poor quarter healers did not. They moved through the beds, gathering what remained without stripping any plant beyond recovery. Zevran watched them work. What happens when the lines are cut? The garden heat needs somewhere living to settle. And the mark? It will continue drawing until your body stops expecting borrowed flame. Lysen answered sharply. Removing the mark may cause complete dragon heart rupture. Odelia did not soften the danger. She made your fire dependent upon replacement heat. If we leave it, the garden dies to keep you stable. If we break it, your own flame must decide whether it can carry you. Zevran looked toward the burned beds. How long? I do not know. Can the garden survive another full draw? No. The word left no room for royal delay. Zevran placed one hand over the treatment mark. Break it. Lysen moved despite the guards. You are allowing an unlicensed apothecary to gamble with the crown. Odelia turned. You licensed the hand that made him dependent. You unlicensed the hand that recognized it. Zevran's gaze remained on Odelia. Do what is required. She did not mistake trust born of desperation for repair. She only began. The first conduit was cut beside a clay cradle lined with coal root bark. Blue heat entered the living material and steadied. The second released into frost lung fiber. The third into untreated ash. Each time, part of the garden lifted. Each time, Zevran's pulse worsened. By the 6th cut, bronze fire flashed beneath his skin and vanished into blue. Odelia mixed ember lily oil with crushed frostmint and spread the cooling compound around the treatment mark. The ash bees followed the exposed ingredients. They carried minute traces between oil and skin, completing the same material chain they had used for the antidote. Not obedience. Not affection. Chemistry moving through wings. The silver threads beneath Zevran's skin surfaced one by one. Odelia caught each with narrow forceps and drew it free. He did not cry out. His hand closed around the garden stone until blood entered the cracks. The final thread remained above his heart. Lysen's composure broke. If you remove that line, the crown flame may stop. Odelia looked at her. That is why you left it deepest. Zevran's breathing failed for one beat. Then another. His eyes found Odelia's. Finish it. She pulled. The silver thread came free. Every extraction needle in the garden went dark. Zevran collapsed against her shoulder as his dragonfire surged without borrowed heat. Bronze flame burst across the stones, uncontrolled but his own. Odelia lowered him carefully and held the cooling compound against his chest until the rhythm beneath it returned. Weak, uneven, living. Around them, heat flowed outward through the 7 prepared cradles and back into the roots. The garden had stopped feeding the king. For the first time in weeks, his dragon heart was carrying only its own fire. A physician lifted the removed silver thread. At its end hung a black crystal barb coated with dried nightbane. The mark had not merely carried replacement heat into Zevran. It had delivered poison whenever his natural flame tried to rise. The final extraction point had never been the cabinet. It had been the Dragon King's own heart. The black crystal barb had not killed Zevran because Lysen needed him alive. Alive enough to rule. Weak enough to require her. The attending physician placed the removed barb inside a clean glass tray. Dried nightbane clung to its edges in dark violet threads. The same mineral residue marked Lysen's blue crystal clasp and the silver wire around the overheated blood vial. 3 objects. 1 compound. 1 treatment system. Lysen stood beneath guard at the edge of the garden, her face composed again. A contaminated implant proves failure of maintenance, she said, not deliberate poisoning. Odelia continued pressing frost-lung paste against Zevran's chest. The barb sat beneath the final treatment line. To prevent rejection, it released nightbane whenever his natural flame rose. Controlled suppression is required when dragonfire becomes violent. Zevran opened his eyes. His breathing remained shallow, but the blue shadow had begun fading from his throat. You called every attempt my body made to resist you violent. Lysen looked at him with the patience of a physician addressing a frightened patient. Majesty, your dragon. Heart was unstable before the implant. Without my intervention, you may have died months ago. You made every recovery look like relapse. I prevented your fire from consuming you. Odelia lifted the black barb from the tray with narrow forceps. You did not poison him to murder him. Lysen's gaze shifted toward her. You poisoned him until his fire would answer only your hand. The court physicians remained silent. Not one defended Lysen. Not one stepped away from her either. They had worked inside her protocols long enough to understand that guilt could be distributed until no single person felt responsible. Zevran pushed himself upright. Bring every implant record, every N7 assessment, and every flame containment authorization into the garden. Lysen's expression sharpened. Those files contain protected medical histories. They also contain my crown seal. Royal authority does not become criminal because a treatment caused complications. No, Odelia said. It becomes responsible when it makes objection impossible. The records were carried outside under guard. Tables meant for medicinal pruning became an open archive. Poor quarter healers stood beside court physicians. Retired apothecaries were called from the palace service quarters. Women whose licenses had been withdrawn watched their own names emerge from sealed files. Odelia read the sequence aloud. N7 suppression administered. Visible flame reduced. Failure confirmed. License withdrawn. Consent assumed. Residual flame contained. Royal use authorized. The same sequence appeared again. And again. Not one label said stolen. Not one record named the treatment's effect as loss. The infirmary had turned theft into a chain of acceptable medical verbs. Lysen faced the gathered healers. You were not stripped for convenience. Each of you demonstrated unstable flame. An elderly burn healer raised one hand. My fire appeared only when damage scales required sealing. Conditional response is unreliable. It was reliable for 40 years. A former fever apothecary stepped forward. You tested me in an empty room with no fever present. Medical fire must answer when summoned. By whose rule? Lysen looked toward Zevran. The crown's. Every face turned to him. Odelia did not protect him from the answer. His signature stood beneath the decree that defined safe flame as flame performing on command before royal examiners. He had allowed the infirmary to judge women's bodies by whether they obeyed inside controlled rooms. Then he had allowed their remaining heat to become crown property. Zevran removed the royal treatment seal from his belt. This decree is suspended. Lysen's voice cut through the garden. If you suspend it now, every contained flame becomes legally unguarded. Every patient treated through infirmary circulation becomes vulnerable. Every healer previously ruled unsafe may demand reinstatement without examination. They may demand review, Zevran said. You will break royal medicine apart during a poisoning crisis. No, I will stop your office from calling dependency safety. Lysen turned to the court physicians. Do none of you understand what follows? The king cannot maintain his fire without controlled heat. The garden is damaged. The cabinet is cooling. If my authority falls, you lose both treatment sources. Odelia stood. The garden is not a treatment source. She looked toward the surviving beds. It is a living medicine system. It serves whoever needs what it can replace. That is not enough for a crown. It was enough for everyone your infirmary priced out. The ash bees lifted from the ember lilies. They did not swarm Lysen's face or form accusation above her head. They followed the nightbane residue. A narrow stream moved from the barb to the crystal clasp lying on the evidence table. Another traced the silver blood vial. Then several bees crossed toward Lysen's white apothecary robe. They settled along the inner seam near her left pocket. Material following material. Lysen reached for the seam. A guard caught her wrist. Odelia approached without haste. Open it. There is nothing there. Then the bees will move on. Zevran gave the order. The pocket lining was cut. Inside lay a flat crystal dosing key, small enough to enter the treatment basin without appearing in the inventory. Nightbane residue darkened its grooves. The attending physician recognized it. That key adjusts implant release. Lysen's expression did not collapse. She became colder. Emergency dosage required private access. The king's condition could not wait for council approval. How often did you change it? Zevran asked. As often as necessary. Without recording the increase? Because your fire became more dangerous. My fire became more resistant. Resistance and danger are not separate in a Dragon King. There was the belief beneath everything. Lysen had not acted from simple jealousy. She believed uncontrolled royal flame threatened the kingdom, and that only a medically dependent king could be managed safely. Odelia looked at the women whose fire had been contained after they stopped performing predictably. You treated age the same way. Power that cannot be commanded becomes risk, only to those who confuse command with care. Zevran ordered Lysen's medical chain removed. She did not resist. You will need me before nightfall, she said. His natural flame has not sustained itself in months. Odelia looked toward the central ash tree. Blue heat moved weakly through the surviving roots. The garden will not be drained for him again. Zevran heard her. So what happens when my heart fails? You receive what can be prepared without killing another patient's medicine. And if that is not enough, then the crown learns the limit everyone else has lived under. He accepted the sentence without asking her to soften it. The public treatment tables remained open until every healer's record was copied. The cabinet samples were placed under independent care. No flame was returned without assessment by the person from whom it had been taken. At sunset, one final ledger was found beneath Lysen's dosing records. It listed every royal treatment strengthened with residual healer flame. Beside each entry appeared the medicine withheld elsewhere to preserve palace supply. Frostlung for the poor quarter. Coalroot for laborers with burned lungs. Ember lily oil for widows working the ash furnaces. The Dragon King had not been kept alive by one stolen garden alone. His treatment had been built from years of medicine denied to people whose names never entered the royal chamber. Odelia closed the ledger. Saving Zevran was no longer the only question. The kingdom would now have to decide whose lives royal medicine had always considered expendable. By morning, royal medicine no longer had a private door. The ledgers were carried from the Blue Ember Garden to the palace steps, where poor quarter healers, retired apothecaries, furnace widows, and court physicians read the same records beneath the same light. No entry remained sealed, because it concerned royal blood. No patient disappeared behind a title. Odelia stood beside the copied treatment lists, while the names of withheld medicines were read aloud. Frostlung diverted from the poor quarter. Coalroot reserved for palace chambers. Ember lily oil taken from widow clinics to maintain Zevran's treatment basin. Each line showed the same belief. The crown's survival carried greater weight than the bodies supporting it. Lysen stood beneath guard without her medical chain. She did not confess. She defended the system until the final hearing. A kingdom cannot distribute medicine equally during crisis, she said. Priority preserves order. Odelia looked toward the people whose remedies had been delayed, diluted, or denied. Priority is not the same as secrecy. The king's death would have endangered every district, and so your office made smaller deaths acceptable because no throne stood above them. Lysen's expression remained cold. Medicine must choose. Then the people paying the cost must be allowed to see the choice. Zevran stepped onto the palace stones without his breastplate. The black crystal treatment mark remained visible across his chest, darkened where the silver threads had been removed. His dragonfire had not fully recovered. Sometimes bronze heat entered his palms. Sometimes nothing answered. He no longer allowed physicians to call one reaction strength and the other failure. I signed the Royal Medical Safety Decree, he said. I gave one office the authority to diagnose dangerous flame, withdraw licenses, assume consent, and use what remained. He did not look toward Lysen alone. My seal made the taking lawful before I ever asked whether it was just. The gathered healers listened without offering him relief. Odelia did not give it either. Zevran continued. I feared the court would see my changing fire as weakness. I concealed the numbness in my hands and the failures in my dragon heart. That fear made certainty attractive, even when certainty required me not to examine who supplied it. His admission did not erase the burned garden. It did not return medicine already withheld. But it placed his responsibility where Lysen's crimes could no longer hide it. The decree was dissolved that afternoon. In its place, Odelia required 3 new laws. No healer could lose ownership of living flame through diagnosis alone. No consent could be assumed from license withdrawal. No royal treatment could use medicine, residual heat, or garden flame without naming what patient or community would receive less because of it. Zevran accepted all three. Then he offered Odelia restoration as Royal Flame Apothecary. She refused before the court clerk finished unfolding the appointment. "You stripped my authority because one office called my body decline," she said. "I will not take it back as a favor from another office." "What do you require?" Zevran asked. "The Blue Ember Garden leaves royal ownership." A silence settled across the palace steps. Odelia continued. "It becomes a public healing trust governed by working healers, patients from the poor quarter, and the retired women whose flame was contained without consent. The garden stands on crown ground," a counselor said. "So did the conduits." No one answered that. Zevran signed the transfer. The trust received the garden, the medicinal records, the ember cabinet, and every surviving residual flame sample. Crown physicians could request medicine. They could no longer command it. The vessels were opened one at a time over the following months. These were not souls waiting to fly home. Some samples had weakened beyond safe return. Some healers chose to leave their residual flame inside public treatment cradles. Others reclaimed small portions through careful reintegration supervised by the women whose knowledge the infirmary had dismissed. No spectacle restored what years had changed. No single ceremony made everybody young again. The work respected what could return and what could not. Odelia's vessel remained empty. She never attempted another extraction. Her visible palm flame did not return. Instead, blue warmth moved through coal root when she cut its bark correctly. Ember lily oil brightened beneath her measure. Ash bee wings carried medicinal heat between surviving beds without circling her as queen or keeper. Her fire had become a method shared with living things. To draw it back into her hands would have weakened the system she had spent a lifetime creating. She chose expansion over possession. The Blue Ember Garden recovered unevenly. Burned terraces remained black as reminders. New frostlung was planted beside the scars, rather than over them. The trust left one section untouched, marked with the names of patients who had lost medicine during the royal withdrawals. Lysen was stripped of office and tried for unauthorized dosing, falsified testing, concealed extraction, and the use of assumed consent. Her conviction rested on protocols, compounds, seals, and treatment chains, not on bees, symbols, or confession. Zevran continued receiving limited medicine from the garden. Never before the public list was read. Never more than the trust could replace. When the supply ran short, he endured the same delay other patients had known. Odelia treated him only when the rotation reached his name. She did not touch him beyond what medicine required. He did not ask her to. One evening near the end of winter, Zevran arrived without guards and found Odelia pruning the central ash tree. The wound left by the extraction needle had closed into a dark silver scar. "My fire answered today," he said. "Did it obey?" He considered the question. "No. It arrived when my body needed it. Then perhaps it is healing." He watched an ash bee gather oil from an ember lily and carry it toward a prepared treatment bowl. "I spent years believing power proved itself by answering command." Odelia returned to the branch in her hands. "And now? Now I think anything living reveals itself by what it can sustain." She looked at him then. Not with forgiveness. Not yet. But without the old need to send him away immediately. A wooden bench stood beside the burned terrace. Zevran waited until she nodded before sitting. He did not reach for her hand. He did not ask whether she might love him after what he had destroyed. He remained while she finished the evening measures, reading every patient's name before the medicine was divided. When the final bowl was sealed, Odelia sat at the opposite end of the bench. Between them, the Blue Ember Garden carried her flame through roots, oil, pollen, and wings. The court had called her empty because fire no longer appeared on command. Zevran now understood that her power had not diminished. It had simply learned to nourish more than one body.